In 1954, one of America's most popular forms of entertainment was put on trial. The accusation? That it was warping the minds of children, promoting perversion, and causing a wave of juvenile delinquency that threatened the entire nation. The culprit wasn't a person or some new street drug. It was a comic book. A comic book so gruesome, so shocking, and so imaginative that it sparked a nationwide panic. We're talking public book burnings, wild accusations in the halls of the United States Senate, and a level of censorship the industry had never seen. This is the story of Tales from the Crypt. It's the story of how a defiant, rebellious, 10-cent comic got banned from coast to coast, and how that very act, designed to kill it, instead made it a legend. This is how a pulpy little book of ghouls and ghosts became one of the most influential publications of the 20th century, forever changing not just comics, but the entire horror genre. Section 1. The Gory Golden Age. To understand how a comic book could cause this much chaos, you have to picture the world it was born into. The years after World War II were a wild, unregulated boom for the American comic industry. The superheroes who ruled the wartime era, their popularity was fading. Readers, many of them now adults and returning GIS, were hungry for something more. They wanted grit, suspense, and stories that reflected a more complicated world. And publishers were happy to deliver. The newsstands of the late 40s and early 50s just exploded with new genres. There were hard-boiled crime thrillers, steamy romance sagas, and wild science fiction tales. And then there was horror. At the absolute peak of this creative bloody mountain was a publisher named EC Comics. But EC didn't start out peddling terror. Founded by Max Gaines as Educational Comics, its first titles were about Bible stories and American history. After Max's tragic death in a boating accident, his 25-year-old son, Bill Gaines, reluctantly took over. Bill had zero interest in his father's wholesome vision. He and his new editor, Al Feldstein, shared a mischievous love for the macabre for spooky radio shows and pulp horror magazines. So, they decided to rebrand. Educational Comics became Entertaining Comics, and their idea of entertainment was horror. In 1950, Tales from the Crypt was officially born. Along with its sister titles, The Vault of Horror and The Haunt of Fear, it was an anthology. Each issue had a few short, self-contained stories, and every single one was a masterclass in suspense and shock. The formula was simple but brutally effective. The stories were twisted morality plays where cruel or greedy people would meet a poetically just and usually gruesome end. A man who buries his wife alive ends up trapped in his own custom coffin. A gluttonous man literally eats himself to death. Those twist endings were everything. These tales were introduced by a ghoulish host, the Crypt Keeper, a cackling, pun-loving ghoul who guided readers through the carnage. His dark humor, along with his fellow Ghoulunatics, gave the comics a personality that was both terrifying and wickedly fun. But what truly set EC apart was the art. Gaines hired the best artists in the business: Johnny Craig, Jack Davis, Wally Wood, Graham, Ghastly, Ingalls, and more. Their work was stunningly detailed, atmospheric, and visceral. They didn't just tell horror stories. They visualized them with a level of craft that was unheard of in comics. Panels dripped with shadow, suspense, and the suggestion of unimaginable violence. For a brief, brilliant period, EC Comics was the undisputed king of the newsstand, pushing the boundaries of what a comic book could be. They were popular, profitable, and creatively fearless. And that fearlessness was about to be their undoing. Section 2. The Moral Panic. While EC Comics was hitting its creative peak, a different kind of horror was brewing in America. The 1950s were an era of deep anxiety. The Cold War was simmering. The threat of nuclear annihilation felt real, and a new social panic was spreading. The juvenile delinquent. Parents, teachers, and politicians were terrified that the nation's youth were becoming violent and disrespectful, and they were desperate for a scapegoat. They found one in the colorful pages of comic books. The man leading the charge was a German-American psychiatrist named Dr. Fredric Wertham. Wertham ran a clinic in Harlem and became convinced that the lurid crime and horror comics his young patients were reading were a direct cause of their behavioral problems. He began a one-man crusade, arguing that comics weren't harmless fun, but a poison that was indoctrinating children toward violence. In April 1954, Wertham unleashed his masterwork, Seduction of the Innocent. The book was a sensationalist attack on the entire comic book industry, claiming comics were a primary cause of juvenile delinquency. He argued they were a school for crime, teaching kids to be violent and disrespect authority. His accusations were wild. He famously claimed Batman and Robin represented a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. He called Superman a fascist symbol. But he saved his most venomous attacks for the horror comics of EC. Wertham plastered his book with panels from Tales from the Crypt, focusing on the most gruesome images he could find: severed limbs, decaying bodies, and what he called a fixation on injury to the eye. His argument was simple and terrifying to a generation of anxious parents. These comics were turning their children into monsters. The book was a bestseller and caused a media frenzy. It tapped into the nation's fears and gave them a clear villain. Parent groups and religious organizations held public comic book burnings, where kids tossed their collections onto pyres in schoolyards and church parking lots. The moral panic was on. Years later, research would expose Wertham as a fraud. A 2012 study by scholar Carol Tilley, who examined Wertham's private notes, found he had manipulated and outright fabricated much of his evidence. She found that he distorted quotes, misrepresented cases, and ignored other factors, like abuse or poverty in his patients' lives, to push his anti-comics narrative. But in 1954, none of that mattered. The panic was real, and it had gotten the attention of the United States government. The stage was set for a showdown. Section 3, the showdown in Washington. The firestorm kicked up by Seduction of the Innocent led straight to the U.S. Senate. Over several days on April 21, 22, and June 4th of 1954, the Senate Subcommittee to Investigate Juvenile Delinquency held a series of highly publicized hearings to determine if comics were, in fact, corrupting America's youth. The star witness was, of course, Dr. Fredric Wertham. He repeated his inflammatory claims, at one point testifying, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They get the children much younger." His testimony painted a picture of an industry run by amoral profiteers poisoning children's minds for money. In the other corner was EC publisher William Gaines. Believing he could defend his work on the grounds of free speech and artistic merit, Gaines voluntarily testified. It was a catastrophic mistake. Gaines was unapologetic and brutally honest, comparing Dr. Wertham's crusade to explaining the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. The hearing quickly turned into a tense cross-examination. The committee's counsel pressed Gaines, asking if there was any limit to what he would publish. Gaines's response became a defining moment in the history of censorship. He insisted his only limit was the bounds of good taste. This was the opening they were waiting for. Senator Estes Kefauver produced the cover of a recent EC comic, Crime Suspense Stories issue number 22, from April-May of 1954. The image, drawn by Johnny Craig, showed a man holding a bloody axe in one hand and the severed head of a woman in the other. Kefauver held it up for the cameras. "This seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body," the senator said. Then he asked the fateful question, "Do you think that is in good taste?" The room was silent. Gaines, without hesitating, gave the answer that would seal his company's fate. "Yes, sir, I do," he replied. For the cover of a horror comic. He even tried to explain his definition of bad taste, suggesting it would have been holding the head higher to show the dripping neck stump, but it was too late. The audience gasped. The press went wild. In that one defiant exchange, Gaines came across as a ghoul, a man so desensitized that he saw decapitation as being in good taste. The headlines were brutal. The comic book industry, terrified of government regulation, knew it had to act fast. The axe was about to fall. Section 4. The Code and the Collapse. The fallout from Gaines's disastrous testimony was immediate. The comic book industry, fearing government censorship was now a sure thing, decided to police itself. To save themselves, they created their own jailer. The major publishers formed the Comics Magazine Association of America, or CMAA, and their first act was creating the Comics Code Authority, CCA, in late 1954. CCA was a self-regulatory body with one purpose: to sanitize comics. The rules were a creative strangulation. The code required that in every instance good shall triumph over evil, and explicitly forbade scenes of excessive violence and lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations. But the most damning rules were aimed squarely at EC Comics. The words horror and terror were explicitly banned from comic book titles. The code also outlawed the depiction of zombies, vampires, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolves. Essentially, every building block of Tales from the Crypt was now forbidden. To enforce this, a code seal of approval was created. If a comic didn't have that seal on its cover, distributors wouldn't touch it. For Bill Gaines, this was the end of the line. His entire brand was now illegal. On September 14, 1954, Gaines announced he was canceling his horror and crime comics. Tales from the Crypt published its final issue, number 46, in early 1955, and then vanished. Just like that, the most creative and controversial comics in America were gone. The effect was chilling. The vibrant, diverse comic landscape of the early 50s was wiped out almost overnight. Horror as a genre was dead. Crime comics were defanged. The newsstands were flooded with safe, bland, code-approved stories. The Crusaders had won. They had slain the monster. But in doing so, they had no idea they had just created a legend. Section 5. The Undying Legacy. Bill Gaines was down, but he wasn't out. While the Comics Code had destroyed his horror empire, he had one last trick up his sleeve. A little humor comic called Mad. In a stroke of genius, Gaines and his editor Harvey Kurtzman converted Mad from a comic book into a black-and-white magazine in 1955. That clever format change meant it was no longer subject to the Comics Code. Freed from the censors, Mad Magazine became a cultural institution, its satire shaping an entire generation. It was the ultimate act of defiance. But what about Tales from the Crypt? The comics were gone, but their spirit refused to die. The ban, ironically, was the best thing that could have happened to their legacy. They became forbidden's fruit, treasured artifacts from a more dangerous, creative time. The kids who read them grew up to be the next generation of horror masters. Stephen King has repeatedly cited EC Comics as a major influence. George A. Romero, the father of the modern zombie film, was a devoted reader. So were countless others, from Robert Zemeckis to Neil Gaiman. They all absorbed EC's storytelling DNA, the dark humor, the moral fables, and especially that signature ironic twist ending. You can see that formula in the structure of Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. You can see it celebrated in the 1982 film Creepshow, a direct, loving homage to the comics created by two EC disciples, George Romero and Stephen King. And then, in 1989, the legacy came full circle. HBO, a premium cable channel unbound by the old censors, launched a new TV series, Tales from the Crypt. Hosted by a wisecracking, animatronic Crypt Keeper, the show adapted the original EC stories for a new audience, complete with all the gore, dark humor, and adult themes the code had forbidden. It was a massive hit, running for 7 seasons and cementing the Crypt Keeper as a pop culture icon. In the end, the censors failed. By trying to bury Tales from the Crypt, they only made its legend grow stronger. They turned a simple comic book into a powerful symbol of creative freedom and a cautionary tale about moral panic. The gory, glorious Tales EC, published for just 5 short years, didn't just change horror comics. They proved that you can burn a book, you can ban a comic, but you can never, ever kill a good story. The story of Tales from the Crypt is more than just the story of a comic. It's a battle for the soul of popular art that played out on newsstands, in public burnings, and on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The creation of the Comics Code was a victory for censorship that neutered an entire industry for decades. But it was also the catalyst that transformed EC Comics from a popular publisher into a cultural martyr, ensuring it would be remembered forever. If you enjoyed this dive into comic book history, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments, what do you think is the most influential horror story ever told? We'd love to hear your thoughts.